to start this conversation with a trigger warning. I'll bring up some hard to hear topics to help shine some light in dark places and open us up to freedom from sexual confusion. Remember, there is nothing we can experience or feel that God doesn't show compassion for or provide support to see us through.
Welcome to the Sifted Wheat Podcast with Leslie Lamb, a counselor by profession, a minister of truth, and a lover of people. This is a safe place where she sets a path for others to learn how to move through hard seasons with confidence and grace, encouraging your faith, empowering your choices, and challenging your perceptions through the Word, the wisdom from years of counseling others, and her own experience of being sifted. Here's Leslie.
Before I get into the depth of this message, I want to make sure that I state that despite what it might have sounded like in my last impassioned episode, I do not believe all pastors are immoral or push sex against women. The fact that there are any that do is where my heart is grieved. But I would say that the vast majority of pastors do use the pulpit for good and for the gospel. Unfortunately, they aren't dramatic or pushing their personalities for the point of influence, so we don't hear much about them. And that, in my opinion, is a travesty of the church and a deterrent to the freedom of many. Now that I've said that, sex isn't everything, and everything isn't sex. One of the most significant works I get to do in therapy is helping others remove the messages of shame. Sex and sexuality is one of the primary places that shame lives. Things happen and choices are made, and the result is very often that embedded sense of self that dehumanizes and resists true intimacy and leads to isolation. One of my favorite quotes is, "Shame dies when stories are told in safe spaces." I'm sure you've seen it on social media a time or two, and it's true. True emotions are actually released when the narrative of shame ceases to control them. For instance, I often hear people say, "I shouldn't feel bad about it because other people have experienced worse." I should note that this is usually stated in a story about sexual molestation or shame-based sexual experiences, or really any other impactful space that wasn't identified by culture as quote-unquote traumatic. But both things can be true. You can feel very bad about and because of something that happened to you. And yes, other people have experienced worse. But neither of those realities cancels out your emotions unless you let it. And suppressed emotions become punishment for self and others generally not involved in the original experience. Okay, I went into clinical mode. Let me get back on track. There are two things that I want to highlight in this conversation about how sex is not everything: non-sexual touch and mechanisms of intimacy. Let's start with mechanisms. This might be surprising to some, but sex isn't true intimacy. It can be a source of intimacy, the sign of intimacy, and engagement fueled by intimacy, but in and of itself, sex isn't intimacy. It's why we have conversations about false intimacy with people who struggle with sexual addiction. If sex was intimacy, the more we had it, the more fulfilled we would be. But instead, it's a bottomless pit that demands more and more because it isn't scratching the itch. It's just aggravating it. It's a way to physically connect without the vulnerability of true intimacy, while the whole time the soul is starving to be known and loved deeply. Do you remember the movie Pretty Woman? If you were born after the 80s, you might not. But in that movie, Julia Roberts plays a prostitute. She's bought for the weekend by a wealthy businessman who has permission to do whatever he wants to her, except kiss her on the lips. Why? Because for her, that was a line that would move her out of a physical space into a space of intimacy. It was her way of protecting herself and keeping something to herself that couldn't be bought. The body was for sale, but her heart was her own. True intimacy is more than a physical connection. It's a soul connection, being known and being loved. Unfortunately, it's been sold to us as true intimacy, which is what makes it confusing in relationships and marriages, when the action of sex isn't backed up by the evidence of intimacy. It's why washing dishes and taking care of the kids and just being available emotionally matters so much to women and men. Only we've been lied to. We've been taught that for men, for them to be real men, or that the evidence of a good marriage is the time spent in the bedroom. In fact, research states that one of the signs of infidelity, whether emotional or physical, is increased sexual activity with your partner, not always less. So what I was taught, that if I didn't satisfy my man, someone else would, isn't necessarily true. And it could even be possible that the more that I did for my husband sexually could actually inspire an appetite that he would seek others to fulfill. Think about that for a minute. Sexual addiction is marked by an unsatiated need to engage sexually with multiple partners or in scenarios of fantasy where the physical fulfillment of sexual gratification is met, but the soul is left starving for more. Allowing the mechanisms of sex to be actions that can be engaged separately from that intimate connection. On the other hand, there are actions of sexuality that can be connected to something that's not sexual. This is a very important space to bring awareness to why there is no such thing as consensual sex with a child. First of all, I hate that we're even having to have this conversation, but children are not sexual. They are taught sexuality. You can introduce sexual actions to a child and they will engage them, but not in the same way and for the same reasons that an adult will. They'll be looking for intimacy where the adult is seeking physical satisfaction. Many a client has shared a shame-filled experience of this, myself included. A child wants to be loved and known. They come out of the womb with a deep desire for true intimacy. Seeking secure attachment, we look for a place where we feel safe, secure, seen, and comforted. We were created to experience it by our affectionate and loving Creator. It's inherent to our DNA. Only a fallen and depraved world has created pain where goodness was meant. My first experience with being molested wasn't about me wanting to be physically engaged with another person. As a young child, I wasn't seeking sexual fulfillment. I didn't even know what that was. I was seeking connection. It was about me wanting to be important, wanting to be seen and feel wanted and to make those around me happy. And the person that molested me encouraged me to think that was what was happening. So my brain got wired incorrectly, that intimacy means touch and touch means connection and connection means importance. Incorrect. As a child, I couldn't read the other person's mind or critically think through what was happening, so I assumed they shared my mind and my intentions. What I thought and felt is what they thought and felt, only I was wrong. For all intents and purposes, it would have seemed as if I was consensual in the same way that a drunk person consents to having sex. They can't, by the way. The inability to think through my choices and to consider what is happening beyond what is felt is a necessary part in the definition of the word consensual. Therefore, with a limited cognitive development of the brain, consensual sexual engagement with children should not even be a conversation, and I will die on that hill. Another thing that often gets misread and misunderstood is masturbation, which I prefer to refer to as self-soothing behavior. In children, this is a more accurate description of the physical exchange that is occurring in that place. So many young women and even older women have come to me in shame over this subject. They don't even want to use the word because it feels so wrong to be talked about. I have the responsibility of detaching the shame from the activity, to direct them to what they are actually seeking in that choice rather than what a sexual culture tells them. Because if we know what we seek, we can find other ways to meet that need, healthier ways, more fulfilling ways that don't result in more shame, that only leads to more unhealthy mindsets and choices. If we don't start to disconnect sexuality from some of these things, we will believe the lies that inform our sexuality. There is such a thing as non-sexual touch. There is such a thing as physical intimacy that doesn't include having sex. There is and there should be. And with the lack of oxytocin most people are experiencing in this space of affection and touch, it's no wonder that we've turned to devices to get that dopamine hit, that we run to a screen for comfort or satisfaction, and why we've been so confused about why our identity feels so wrapped up in our sexual choices and preferences. So I want to ask a couple of questions in this space, and I really want you to think about them over the next couple of weeks. Don't worry, I'm adding them to the show notes so that you can look back at them on your own time. They're that important. The first question is, where have you confused the mechanisms of sex with intimacy? One thing that will help in answering this question is reflecting on whether or not that activity brings long-term or short-term fulfillment. If it's short-term and ungratified, dig deeper and ask, where have you placed expectations on yourself or those in your life to meet those needs sexually instead of connecting more vulnerably to be seen and known? Where do you need to set boundaries in relationships so that you can be more confident that it truly is a healthy, life-giving relationship and not a means of releasing sexual frustration? The saddest stories to me are the ones where women and young men have decided to protect their bodies, to set boundaries with intimacy due to poor choices in the past and or a renewed sense of identity, who have realized that their value is more than their body and what they can give. And those that they are in relationship will emotionally manipulate them out of those boundaries and then shame them for giving in. It happens so often. Maybe it's happened to you. It happens especially in Christian circles, and that is devastating to me. We need to change that today, and change starts with asking questions about what we have always done and whether we should continue to do it. Next, I want you to think about your own story of sexuality. How old were you when you had your first experience? What belief systems resulted from that? Are you still living out of those fears and expectations? Have you resorted to sexual activities to meet non-sexual needs? Then, as parents or as an adult, we need to ask, have you mistaken sexual behaviors in children as dirty or shameful without considering that they might not understand either of those terms? This is really important because if you aren't careful, you'll present a narrative of identity and sexuality that can impact them for the rest of their lives. Have you shamed yourself for these things? Have you considered what you might need when you resort to self-soothing behaviors or pornography? Have you taken time to be honest and ask the question, am I seeking sex, or do I really need to be loved, held, seen, valued, comforted? Am I bored, tired, or emotional? What can I do to shift this temptation to something that is more satisfying and less shame-filled? I have these awkward conversations here because I believe it matters. The answers to these questions, they matter. Don't look right over them and move on to the next episode. Stop, pause, reflect, gather information, and create change. A shift in our sexual culture in the church begins and ends with those of us willing to ask the hard questions and to sit with God to help us find better ways to live. This might be a space where you need to invite in some therapeutic or wise counsel. It's okay. And nothing you can say to them is going to bring more shame from them. We understand. We've heard it. You're not alone. Don't feel like you have to sort this through all on your own. Lean into your community and or professionals to help you sort them through. If you have a small group that you're part of and you feel safe, maybe you can sort through these questions there. You don't have to be isolated in this process because that's what shame tells us to do. You can open that lid of shame and secrecy and let the light in. It's okay. God is there, and no topic of conversation is off limits with him. As I close, I want to repeat the words found in Deuteronomy. where God said to a new culture in a new land who were moving toward liberation and promise and away from bondage and slavery of a foreign land. He said, I set before you a choice, life or death, blessings and curses. Choose life so that you and your descendants might live. I want you to live, really live in true intimacy and away from shame. I want the same for your children and their children. I want to see generational breakthrough from a hypersexualized culture. To set us up for next time, we're going to be diving into attraction. And we'll look at the 3 laws of attraction and how we can develop a better understanding for how to get out of a trap of sexuality that often confuses us and those around us. Until then, follow us on Instagram. Leave ratings and reviews so others can find us, and share this podcast with those you love. I believe that together we can build a healthier church, even in the space of sexuality. It's not taboo unless we refuse to talk about it. So let's normalize healthy conversations about sex, and let's start with sharing this series.